This is the Headless Professor video series. Our topic for today is the ontological argument for the existence of God. This particular argument is also known as the argument by definition. It has received support from various thinkers throughout the ages. I'm going to start not with the earliest formulation, but with the simplest, that of French mathematician René Descartes in the 17th century. Here's Descartes' formulation of the ontological argument. Now, the first premise is that God is defined as a perfect being. Most people would accept that starting point, and therefore God has all the qualities of perfection. Well, most people would accept that too. Let's take a look at some of those qualities of perfection. One would be omnipotence. In other words, God is all-powerful. Another would be omniscience. God is all-knowing. And another would be beneficent. In other words, God is good, supremely good. And another quality of perfection would be existence. And therefore, God, having all of the qualities of perfection, must exist. Now, this particular argument strikes a lot of people as somewhat sneaky, that it is sort of assuming what it tries to prove. Because when you go back to one of the premises, we have to assume that God has existence in order for him to be perfect, and that really seems to be a play on words almost. Well, this formulation of the argument is a bit weak, but let's consider a couple of stronger formulations. Indeed, the very first formulation of the argument, about 1,000 years ago in the 11th century, by St. Anselm, is perhaps a stronger version of the argument. It's a little bit harder to understand, however. Anselm says, God is the greatest being, the greatest possible being, a being greater than which none can be conceived. We would accept that understanding of God and understand it as being God, being omniscient, omnipotent, and beneficent. But here's where Anselm's argument gets quite interesting. He says, now a God who existed only within our minds as a pure abstract concept would not be as great as a God who really does exist. And therefore, because God is the greatest possible, the greatest conceivable being, God must exist. This is a very difficult point to comprehend, let alone refute. A more modern formulation of the argument came from 20th century theologian Charles Hartshorne, who developed the argument along the lines of what he called modalism. Hartshorne says that there are three different levels or types of existence. He calls them the mode of necessary existence, contingent existence, and necessary non-existence. Necessary existence means that something exists and it must necessarily exist. It would be impossible for it not to exist. Contingent existence is something that could exist or could not exist depending upon the contingencies. Now, you and I both, and this table and this camera and this computer, all have contingent existence. It is possible, it is conceivable that we do not exist. There was a time when the computer did not exist. It was just atoms of metal and silicon. There was a time when I did not exist. And there may be a time in the future when this computer or I will no longer exist. and the very atoms that compose us will decompose into something else. Finally, there is necessary non-existence, things that it would be impossible to have existence, such as a square circle or a round triangle. Well, here's what Hartshorne says. God could not have contingent existence. Now, the three possibilities, we know that God could not be in category number 2, because if God is truly the architect and creator of the universe and will exist from before the beginning of time until after the end of this world, God could not have contingent existence. So let's scratch out that possibility. So God either necessarily exists or God either necessarily has non-existence. But Hartshorne says, wait a minute, God does not fall within the category of necessary non-existence because he is not impossible. He is not like a square, triangle, or something else which is totally impossible and self-contradictory. Therefore, by process of elimination, God must have necessary existence. God necessarily exists. This argument is actually quite difficult to refute, but my evaluation of it is, I think it really misses the point, along with all the formulations of the ontological argument. It leaves us with an abstract God, not a personal one that we need to worship and obey. If you have any comments about these videos, write me, brink@usa.com.